So I want to ask y'all something. When was the last time that you were actually bored? Like
Mm.
really genuinely bored. Like my feed recently has been full of low stim environments for kids and millennials and Gen Z ditching their smartphones or going back to like pen and paper, getting less
Mm.
screen time. And I think that we forgot what it felt like. And I think brands kind of forgot too. Everyone's rushing towards the tech. I'm talking about not needing someone to even create an experience at all, just interacting with your environment and using your imagination.
I mean, I resonate with that from like my family and my kids, but I want to push back a little on that because I think there's a version of this conversation that gets very romantic very fast.
Mm.
And we're in 2026 now, running a
Mhm.
business, and our entire infrastructure is digital. So when we talk about the analog trend, are we talking about a real cultural shift that brands need to respond to? Or are we talking about a very specific kind of person who honestly can afford to opt out of it?
Mm.
Well, I think maybe that's the wrong question because it's not about opting out of digital. It is about, what people are reaching for when the digital stops being enough. I think what I keep seeing is that brands getting this right isn't necessarily about abandoning their digitals. It's more about like they're using it to understand what their audience really craves. And then they're showing up there in the real world with friction and on purpose.
I love that word friction. It's like friction as a feature. I think maybe it's the friction that got lost in all of that optimization.
Those are the old rules. This is brand new rules.
We're making brand new rules, taking things in a brand new direction, coloring outside of the lines and doing things our own way.
Welcome back to Brand New Rules. On this podcast, we break down branding, challenge dated advice, and bring you fresh perspective you can use, or at the very least, will make you think. I'm Jasmine, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Christina and Ariana. And we have real conversations about what it takes to build a brand that gets noticed and how branding shows up in culture, trends, and the way people connect every day. We're also the founders of Groundfire Agency. So if you want to see what we're building beyond the mic, check us out on the website, Instagram, and YouTube. Now, let's get into it.
Okay, so before we get into what this really means for brands, I want to make sure that we're all looking at the same thing. So I think the analog trend, right, is getting used to describe a few different things that are actually quite different. And I think, Jasmine, you touched on this in the beginning, but it's a response to overstimulation, depression, anxiety. Sometimes it's more about anti-establishment and corporate, but it's a response to people feeling something and wanting to go back. They want to kind of check out from this digital era. Not all the time, but they want that space to not have to be constantly in it.
This has been creeping up on us for a while. I noticed a few years ago, events like picnics in the park started popping up a lot here in
Mhm.
Houston, or there's been meet us in the park for yoga. Everything's starting to go back outside. People are encouraging you to not use your phones at certain events. I went to an event that they encourage you to meet new people. So there'll be people you've never met at the table. And there's just a trend going in the direction of people really trying to reconnect to this feeling of humanity, at the
Yeah.
end of the day. And as it relates to companies being able to shift into that, I think the word tension, to your point, Christina, comes up a bit more because how do you hold the line? We live in an AI world that's increasingly becoming more and more digitized. And we're also leaning into this analog trend where people want to return to what makes them feel like a human being. So, how do you hold that tension and keep your company and your brand sharp and moving forward?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we are here with the friction, but we just haven't named that it is friction because, to your point, people are craving more of the humanness of things, touching grass, being together without screen time. And I think that's peaked right now because of the fact that where AI is going and how quickly it's moving. And honestly,
Yes.
people are feeling a little scared. right now? What
Yes.
does this mean for us, not only in our jobs, but how we continue to interact with one another, right? So I think the friction is already there. I'm just naming that we're starting to react to this analog trend because of that.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. We've been in the modern era. We're all millennials. We went from not having tech to having it. Like, we've been in this era for a while, but I think the pace at which tech is coming out now is so different than it was 20 years ago. And it's so exponential that we're all like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, maybe now we're just feeling that tension and that friction. Now all of a sudden they're like, we need to slow down a little bit. Like, I'm here for the technology, I'm here for the advances, and what else do we need to do to counterbalance that a little bit?
I agree with that. I think part of this is just you don't know where you're going until you know where you came from, and being able to, your point, like live in the balance and live in that tension. And when we're thinking about companies trying to figure out how to hold the balance, everyone's full speed ahead in AI, full speed ahead in this touch grass analog era. So how are you able to make sure that you're meeting your clients, your customers, your consumers, or your audience in the middle of that and maintaining your integrity and point of view throughout the whole, encounter? It's just
Yeah.
an interesting time that we're in. I think that's challenging as
But
a company to think through.
yeah, but these are not niche preferences either. They're actually measurable, like consumer behavior too. There's a way to think about the data and make sure that it's being impactful to your business.
Yeah, and I think those brands that find that balance and can hold that tension, that make it into these pockets of that intentional life, they can get something out of it that other brands might not. But it can't be trend chasing. They can't go analog just because analog's trending. It has to make sense for the brand, it has to make sense for the consumers, and it has to be intentional.
I want to be honest about something as we move into the brand positioning, because I don't think this trend is as universal as sometimes it gets presented. Like, who actually gets to opt out? Is there a class dimension here? I
Mm.
kind of made that point above, like referencing that. Who gets the option to opt out? Not everyone has this luxury of deliberately downgrading their tech, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, y'all, the dumb phones, the not so smartphones are going for $700 right
It's
now. Some of them.
ridiculous.
Isn't that crazy?
That is ridiculous.
Crazy. I want my Nokia with Snake on it. That's it.
My first
remember
phone, by the way.
Snake.
I
Yeah.
loved it.
Yes.
The memories. But no, seriously, like not everyone can spend their weekend just casually strolling through a record store, right? And there's the question that's worth asking, about whether being constantly online is even the same experience across income levels. Like what you're consuming and whether you have a choice.
Yeah. Oh, that's a
I know I
super
got deep,
interesting
but
position, Ariana. Because, like, yeah, I mean, I'm getting all this content, which is how I started this episode, right? I'm getting all this content. Well, we all know that, like, I'm getting push content that I would like. So it is a privilege, right? It is a place where people, you know, $700 also for a dumb phone is unreal. Like, I talk about trying to get a dumb phone all the time, but honestly, if I saw $700, like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
There are
What's the
so many other solutions that I can try first before I spend the same amount as a smartphone costs. But I think it's a really interesting point, and I don't know, there is no answer, right? Because for some people, taking a break and going analog is a real solution to anxiety, to depression, to overstimulation. I delete my Instagram like at least once a quarter because I find myself being overstimulated. And then I go back and, it starts all the cycle all over again. But on the
Right.
flip side, like, there are people who might be working multiple jobs, and like being able to put their kids in front of YouTube while they try to cook dinner for their family is also a real solution.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
I think it's that friction, and it's what works for you and your lifestyle and your needs, which is the same thing brands should be thinking about, is what works for their consumers and their lifestyle and their needs. Because I think you're right. It is I don't know if it's necessarily a full class differentiator, although it might be. Like I don't know the research on it, but there's definitely something there where like maybe it's not for everyone, or maybe it just looks different for everyone.
Yeah, but I think and it does, it absolutely does. And I think as it relates to companies, so if it looks different for everyone and we're all, trying to process how to make this digestible for audiences and consumers. How do we do that effectively? I think that, bringing this back to positioning and just keeping those demographics in mind, an argument could be that brands should create analog experience because people are craving them. And I think that should be happening, but they should understand that these trends signal how their audience is feeling and respond to that feeling, not necessarily the format, because we talk a lot about chasing trends and knowing your point of view. So when we think about those two things, think through the best way to do that, because how your audience is feeling and what trend is happening, those are two different things.
Mhm.
Those two come together, but how do we effectively push that forth as a brand? How do we do that effectively without
Yeah.
trend chasing?
I love that line, like leaning into the feeling, not the format. I
Yeah.
think that's huge. And I think the feeling underneath it all, and this I think is regardless of like class levels and demographics, is there is infinite content, constant optimization, like everything is monetized. Even people's grief is monetized online, people's happiness, like every emotion is monetized. And I think the analog trend is the response to how that feels. So leaning into that feeling and figuring out what that means. I love that positioning, the feeling, not the format. So, like, yeah, not every brand necessarily needs a physical activation, but every brand should ask, like, are we a part of what people are trying to recover from? Are we part of the problem or part of the solution? And if we are a part of the problem, do we need to become part of the solution? Like, how can we, again, hold that tension, hold that friction? Because, not every tech company, not every SaaS company is going to be like, stop, no more optimization. We're going to do an activation now. Like, that would not
Yeah.
make any sense.
Mhm.
To Ari's point in the beginning, we run a business in 2026. We are digital. If HubSpot and Gmail and Claude and ChatGPT were all of a sudden to be like, you know what? You can use our services in person. We'd be like, no, we can't.
Yeah.
We don't even live in
This
the
is
same
not
city.
effective.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not about halting, but it's about knowing what's appropriate and where and why.
And there is also I'd say a dangerous middle, like brands that create physical experience as a marketing stunt while their actual product experience is still frictionless, right? And ultimately forgettable.
Mm.
So I think the real question then is, it's not like, should we go analog? It's who are we for? And what do they actually need from us right now?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's good to dig in here about friction as a feature. We keep, using that word throughout, just because I think it's the most useful reframe for brands and more useful than analog versus digital, because those two right now, they shouldn't be necessarily competing, in my opinion, but married and figured out how to exist in the same space and walk side by side. So we have been optimizing for frictionless for 20 years, but one-click purchase and stream autofill, skip ad, every bit of inconvenience is part of the customer journey. Sometimes I'm grateful for it, sometimes I'm not. This is just making me think about, speaking of the customer journey, I was looking for a new hairstyle on Instagram and I was like, oh yeah, and next thing I know, every other post in my feed is like, want to go to this place for your hairstyle? Want to go to that? I'm like, enough. And I don't know if everyone's
Right.
clicking on the three dots to say enough is enough, but I'm always telling them, like, I don't need to see this again. Anyways, that's my little rant. But so everything started to feel the same, right? In this digital era, interchangeable and disposable. And like you said, Ari, even forgetful, but friction is just the thing that makes an experience feel more like it's meaningful to other people. The walk to the record store, like you mentioned earlier, or the wait for a film to develop. Those are the good old days.
The film
Just the excitement of just thinking
being
about
in
what
the
this
moment,
is gonna...
not looking back into the picture look good. You're like, I'll know in a
No.
week or so.
Oh my goodness. Or
Yeah.
shaking your little Polaroid and trying to figure out if what you saw
I
in
mean,
the camera
Polaroids still
translates.
exist, but you know.
Yeah. Those are still important elements to hold on to, I think, for brands. And we keep talking about them walking side by side or one hand washing the other. And I just think it's just important for brands to really think about how they're showing up with this.
I think even just our just the interaction we just had, right? Like, oh my God, remember that? Like
Yeah.
friction creates memory. Like we remember those times. That's why people are nostalgic for them because they remember them. No
Yeah.
one's over here like, oh my God, remember that time that the website loaded really fast? No, but if it loads slow, we do remember like, oh my God, the website loaded so slow this
Yeah.
morning. Like that friction is noteworthy in our lives. And it is something that humans connect to, good or bad. Yeah, the website loaded slow. That sucked. Or remember when we were so bored that we made up a new game in the backyard? Or made up a dance? I don't know about y'all, but as a 90s kid, I made up lots of
Oh my
dances
God. I was a regular old
because there
choreographer
wasn't TikTok to follow a dance. There was just your music on your CD player.
in
And
your
I was like, Mom,
imagination.
Mom, watch. We're going to perform for you because we
Yeah.
That's a
made
good
up a
performance.
dance.
We did the
Yeah.
same.
Like,
Yep.
that's memorable.
Yeah, and I think so. I actually went to a conference the other week, and one of the presenters there was talking about how do we keep up in a pace of acceleration, but also keep our creativity. And something her whole presentation was on like creating space for ourselves, to, I think what you're getting to have that imagination to think, because she mentioned, you think about our greatest ideas, they don't come from sitting at the desk actually after we've looked through emails or we're managing
No.
our workload.
No.
They happen in the shower, right? When we're
Mhm.
at a piece of calm, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that's, again, where it's at in this balance is like, what are we creating? How are we opening up capacity for ourselves to get
Mhm.
creative?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like knowing who you are, who your audience is, and using that creativity in ways that make sense. I think Liquid Death is like an interesting brand here. And my husband actually loves Liquid Death, but they sell canned water, right? Like they sell water. That's it. And they just sold water in a can that looked like a beer can, right? That was the whole thing. And so it's such you can buy a water anywhere, but you really have to decide if you're going to purchase Liquid Death versus, an Aquafina or a Dasani or even a LaCroix. Like it's about the customer. Has your customer said, I'm a Liquid Death person. I see something of myself in this beer can looking can, right? And I think if I remember correctly, the way that they started was it was for musicians on stage who needed to look apart but also needed water because they're performing and being very active. And it became, are you a Liquid Death person or not? The question that brands are thinking about is where in your customer's experience can you introduce something that requires something of them, requires a choice, requires a decision, and makes them think about it. Like, who am I? What do I want? What do I care about?
Okay, yeah. And you have to decide that you mentioned if you're a Liquid Death person, but that's the friction and it works. But friction is also not good to just be here for friction's sake. That's just bad user experience. The friction has to serve as the experience, but not to obstruct it.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree.
Okay, so we talked last episode about Pinterest making this analog bet, right? These physical activations and real-time experiences, and that it wasn't a format change, right? It was a brand that knew who it was finding a new medium, but for the same truth. And I want to stay on that for a minute because there's another brand that has been doing this for decades, and not as a pivot, but as a founding principle.
Yeah. Think about Patagonia. They're a brand that has built their business entirely around an identity that the best products is the one that lasts, so you don't have to necessarily purchase it again. They have repaired over 100,000 garments. They've run ads that say, don't buy this jacket. They sued the president of the United States to protect national monuments. And none of that is frictionless. Take a drink every time you hear us talk about friction, by the way. But all of it requires something of their customer, right? Patience, commitment, values, alignment. all of the things that Groundfire, to Ariana's point, that we really care about. And obviously they do as well. And every piece of it deepens the relationship, because Patagonia isn't asking you to just buy something. They're asking you to believe in something. And the people who dare you to be loyal in a way that is genuine is hard to manufacture. And we talked a lot about people being forgettable. This is one of those areas of when you lean in like this to your business and create something, a structure this way, it's meaningful and it's hard to forget.
Agree. So let's talk about what Pinterest and Patagonia have in common, right? Neither of them is asking, how do we appeal to the next generation, or how do we go more analog, right? I think they're asking, what does being us actually look like in a world where our audience is choosing more intentional experiences? And then they're doing that thing fully and unapologetically. And I think that's what's amazing. Like Pinterest's like aspiration and vision, like made physical, and then Patagonia, environmental commitment, made behavioral. So two completely different brands with the same underlining move, which is, I think, friction in service of identity.
That's a good one.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's a
Take
good
a
one.
drink. We said friction. But yeah, I mean, neither of these brands are for everyone, and they know that. And I think that's intentional. Patagonia will tell you not to buy their jacket. And they've decided that depth with the right audience is worth more than reaching with everyone. They've really honed in on who they're here for and why and what they want to provide for them. So that's a brand clarity decision, and it's the hardest one to make. So we've been through what the analog counter movement is, why friction works, and what brands that are getting it right, like Pinterest and Patagonia. So now I want to get practical, because we know not every brand needs to do this. So how do we figure out if yours does? So we've got a couple of points here to kind of give a little framework for everyone about how to figure out, should you make any of these decisions? Should you go analog? What does that experience look like?
Okay. So one, ask what your audience is exhausted by. It's not what does your audience want, but really what are they tired of? Because the analog trend isn't about format preference. I think it's about exhaustion, right? We're feeling too like overwhelming, and all of those feelings are exhausting. So if your audience is exhausted by the thing that your brands does, right? Infinite content, constant notification, frictionless optimization. What would it look like to give them relief instead of more?
I like that. I like that a lot, actually. The other recommendation that we have is just to figure out if your brand identity has an analog expression. So this is the Pinterest question. What does being you look like in a physical, slower, and more intentional context? Is that even available to the business that you're running? Because I know we mentioned before, if ChatGPT said show up and use it over here, that wouldn't necessarily be feasible. But there might be other ways that are creative that could really be interactive there. But I'm not their brand strategist, so I won't share any of those preliminary ideas. If you can answer that clearly, if there's a natural analog expression of what your brand already stands for, that's a green light worth exploring. If you're reaching an aesthetic that doesn't connect to your actual identity, then that's a red flag.
Yeah, totally agree. So number 3 is, don't confuse the trend with the insight. So the trend that we're talking about in this episode is people are going analog. Great, cool. The insight is that people are craving intentionality, depth, and experiences that feel like they require something. They're craving unplugging and actually connecting with humans, right? So your brand doesn't have to make vinyl or sell dumb phones to respond to that insight. You just have to ask, where in our customer relationship are we creating depth instead of just convenience?
Yeah, and if your brand's entire value proposition is speed and frictionless, great. So that means that another area that we would say is just know that this is not for every brand, and it's okay. This might seem cool, and it is. I think it's cool. We just got excited talking about all of the great things that we remember that makes us feel grounded and connected to those brands. But If that's not what you can do for your business, you should own that and don't try to slap an analog aesthetic on as a utility product because it's culturally interesting at the moment. The audience will see through it in 5 minutes, as we've discussed at length in every other regard in every episode. So the best version of this is to always figure out what's true for you and your business, your brand, and how do you want to create something that's a real full experience for your audience and consumer, even if it's not analog, right?
Yeah. And that's actually the rule that we want to leave you all with today is digital saturation created the demand for analog, but not every brand needs to go analog. Every brand needs to ask what their audience is craving that they're not getting and whether they have the clarity to show up there. Friction is not a problem to solve. Used intentionally, it's the thing that makes a brand experience feel like it matters. The brands that understand this are going deeper.
Absolutely. So before we go, we just want to ask, where in your brand experience are you optimizing for speed and convenience? And where might your audience actually want you to slow down?
Thanks so much for listening, everyone. We look forward to every other Wednesday with you. Follow Groundfire Agency on Instagram, rate us on Apple Music and Spotify, and send this to someone who's trying to optimize their way into relevance instead of thinking their way there.
This is Brand New Rules.
See you next time.
Thank you.